Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the beginning of Russia Week. I'm going to be starting Russia Week with a fairly somber lecture, which covers the Siege of Leningrad. Not because it's full of laughs, in fact there are no laughs at all. It is a bit of education we need to catch up with, because there's no one alive that will remember this momentous event, not now, but also it's a legacy which isn't tangible, it isn't an infrastructure, it lives in the mind of the Russian people, and I'll end with that. Some of you may have seen my remembrance lecture on the 11th of November when I opened Remembrance Week. That was great. I had some follow-up from folk I've sailed with. It was very nice to hear from you again, email exchanges. Now for tonight, I really have to start not with a warning per se, but I do need to advise you that some of the images you see on the screen tonight might prove a little bit disturbing. So just a warning, and if you don't want to carry on watching, that's fine. And I'll be right up front with you. It is a picture of former people, dead people, and distressing circumstances. But that's how the Siege of Leningrad was. The Siege of Leningrad lives deep in the memory of the Russian people. And it's not a memory that they saw firsthand, it's a perceived and a received memory with which they live. Sometimes, I'm sure you ask yourselves, when the world affairs are churning along, why is Mr. Putin doing this? Or why are the Russians thinking that way? Why can't they just talk about it or meet us halfway? I hope tonight's lecture might help to clear that mist. They have a deep-seated memory that they will not erase. All right, as with all of my lectures, there's a structure. So we'll now look at the structure of the lecture. The outline goes like this. We're going to look at 5 aspects of the Siege of Leningrad. Here we go. The sheer scale of this story, this tale, is huge. It isn't. It's an important event in history, but many of the important events in history are a day or two long. This one is going to last a long time. Next, we're going to look at the politics. If you talk about the Soviet Union, the Second World War, pre-Second World War, post-Second World War, the Cold War, it's always the politics. And I'll show you how that relates to the army and how it directly relates to this tale and its enfolding. We'll move on then to silent suffering. In war, for sure at the front, it is the armies that do the fighting and the armies that will do the suffering. But you know, if the war is happening in your homeland and you can't get away, then the civilian population does the silent suffering. Wherever there are lands, states, nations that have had a civil war, they will know better than most. In the case of the Soviet Union, this is a patriotic war. It's all fought on their homeland, and it is the civilian population that suffers silently. We'll then consider true grit. You can put up with something, you can defy the enemy, but to do it for so long in such terrible circumstances requires true grit. And finally, as with all events in history, we'll look at the legacy. And the legacy isn't just in hard form, something you can see, something you can relate to. It's going to be there. It is going to be here. So let's move on now. We're going to look at numbers. Numbers are boring. Didn't like arithmetic at school, don't like it now. Well, no, numbers are going to matter here because they are big numbers. Let's think about it. Let's move on to how long did this siege How did it happen? I mean, it was 872 days, 2.5 years. Not a siege of a week or a couple of months, 2.5 years. And then we have to consider the people. Well, 1.5 million people were evacuated. Civilians were evacuated from Leningrad during those 872 days. There were soldiers to consider. Let's look at the soldiers. And there were 670,000 registered deaths. A lot of wounded soldiers left the place, and I'll come on to that in more detail shortly. But those registered deaths don't reflect the reality. We know that more than 1 million died. We think it's as high as 1.3 million, so it's an estimate. But the registered deaths alone are staggering. All right, let's move on. We've got to talk about starvation and cold. This is the leitmotif of this story. It's rather like when you watch the film Jaws, you know the shark's around when you hear the music. Well, throughout this entire story, I can tell you that in the background are these two words, starvation and cold. So let's go deeper. Political control, I've alluded to it already. If you look at this man, this is the famous soldier, Georgy Zhukov. This is the man that captured Berlin at the end of April, beginning of May 1945, a cavalry officer, a very good soldier, a very good servant of his state. But he was subject to political control. He answered, as did the other marshals in the Soviet Union, in the Russian army, the Red Army. He answered to the Revolutionary Military Council. There's a guy down here, bottom right. You see, this political control also extended to this, to the lower level units. A colonel's command, so let's look at a colonel's command, it would have a Zampolit, a commissar. Some of you, looking at that picture, may say, I think I know him. Well, you didn't know him when he was that age, because that's taken during the war. But if you're my age, you will certainly remember him as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That is Leonid Brezhnev, who was at the head of the Soviet Union for quite a few years. There he is, a Zampolit, a commissar in the Soviet army during the war. Okay, moving on. We now need to look at the top. If you've got political control and it starts with the Leonid Brezhnevs of this world, down at the colonel command level, where does it stop? It stops right at the very top, the top of the pinnacle. And here is the boss, Joseph Stalin. He is the General Secretary, to give him his proper title, he is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He's a Georgian. He's not comfortable using the Russian language. He's born and brought up speaking Georgian, but there he is. He's top of the shop, and he's a ruthless man. He sweeps away opposition. He sweeps away people of whom he is suspicious. And one of the groups of which he is highly suspicious is the Soviet army. Look at this. He conducts a series of cleaning outs of the Soviet army, which become known in history as the Red Army purges. Now, armies across the world are generally arranged from the bottom up. Of course, you have young officers commanding platoons and companies, and then you get battalions. Then you get to this bottom of this list here, major units. Things called regiments or brigades, depends which army you're talking about. A colonel's command. And there are several regiments or brigades in a division. A division in the Soviet army prior to World War II can be anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men. Several divisions make a corps. and several corps make an army, and you go right up to an army group called a front in the Soviet army. And here are the ranks that command these organizations. They range from the colonel at the bottom right up to what you can see at the top there now, the generals who wear stars. So let's look at it. We've got at the top a front commander, an army group commander, a 5-star general, 4 stars, an army commander, and so on down to the bottom. Now, the Soviet Union, prior to the Second World War and for the Soviet Union, the Second World War breaks out on the 1st of September 1939, just like it does for the French and for the British. America will not come in until late 1941, but the continent of Europe is at war from September 1939. Look at how many generals we've got who have commands in this structure. There are 5 army groups, fronts, so 5 5-star generals. There are 16 armies, 57 corps, 186 divisions, numbers unheard of today, and 456 regiments or brigades, huge numbers. Now look at how many of these generals were purged. Stalin got rid of 3 of the 5 army group commanders. He only left 1 army commander in place. Most of the corps commanders went, most of the division commanders went, and so on, right down to the bottom. In fact, here's the number of the total purges. He gets rid of, in 1937 and 1938, 30,000 officers. Now, I've told you that the war is going to begin for Russia in September 1939. So immediately prior to war, he dispenses with the most experienced and the most qualified officers in his army. It means that the Soviet army is in the hands of over-promoted guys when the war breaks out. Okay, let's move on and have a little look. We're going to talk about something called Operation Barbarossa. Bit of a background to that. When Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September 1939, it has only just, a matter of weeks, signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The world is aghast. These politically opposed regimes, communism and Nazism, are now friends. What they've done is effectively sign the death warrant of Poland. And as the German army sweeps into Poland, by arrangement with the Germans, the Soviet army sweeps in from the east, and they meet in the middle. Poland is divided. The Polish army ceases to exist. Some Polish ships escape to the United Kingdom to form a free Polish navy. Some Polish aircraft escape to the United Kingdom or to France to form a free Polish air force. But the Germans have always got it in their mind that they are going to invade the Soviet Union at some stage. This they plan to do in the spring of 1941. France has fallen on the 25th of June 1940. The British army is cleared out of France, lost all its equipment, gets back home by the skin of its teeth, is then engaged in war in North Africa. And so Hitler has got his war economy going, he's got his armaments program going, and he is going to attack the Soviet Union once the snows have gone in the spring of 1941. But there's a glitch. His fascist ally, Mussolini, invades the Balkans. The Greeks preempt an attack on their country by moving into Albania and defeating the Italian army. Mussolini cries, "Help, help, help." Hitler is forced to send him help and therefore has to delay his attack on Russia, on the Soviet Union. When we go down on our cruisers through the Adriatic and we visit all the lovely Greek places that we go to, I remind people of this. We owe the Greek army, the bravery of the Greek army, quite a lot, because the late entry into the war with the Soviet Union means that the German army has not reached its objectives when winter comes on. Let me show you what happens. Here we go. Here are your objectives. The Northern Army Group is going to take Leningrad, the former St. Petersburg. The Central Army Group is going to take Moscow. And the Southern Army Group is going to take Kiev and then move on beyond Kiev down towards the Donetsk basin and the oil fields. This is the German army plan. Should have started in early April. Doesn't kick off till 22 June. That's going to have a big effect on what happens in the rest of the war. Okay, let's see then. Moving on. The Germans have developed a system of warfare not seen before. It's proved hugely successful in defeating Belgium, in defeating the Netherlands, and in defeating France. It's called Blitzkrieg, German for lightning war. Now, you may get an impression that lightning war and armored warfare means horizon to horizon armored vehicles moving at rapid speed. Not true. Some of it does, but the majority of the German army for the entire war relies on horse transport. That's a typical picture. The German army logistics, horse-drawn carts, and this. The infantry moves on its own flat feet, as infantry always has. It's not being shuffled around the battlefield in armored personnel carriers. Most of it moves on its flat feet. What is new is this. A ground commander, a battalion commander, even if the divisional artillery is still lagging behind, pulled by horses, has got direct contact with ground air support. And he can call in fighter ground attack and light bomber attack to take out his enemy so that he can take his objective before his divisional guns get close. And this, in a panzer division, there'll be an armored group, 1 or 2 armored panzer battalions and 1 or 2 armored tracked infantry battalions, along with a tracked artillery battalion and a tracked engineer battalion. They are the cutting edge. But at least half the division is following on foot or being pulled by a horse. But Blitzkrieg rapidly takes out the Soviet army in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Look at this. Here we look at Poland divided in two. You see where the yellow starts, but if you look to the left of it, it's white. That's because it's German occupied. The yellow is Soviet occupied. And if you look at the legend in the top right corner, from the 22nd of June to the 9th of July, that's only 2.5 weeks. The German army rolls back the Soviet army right up to the Belarus-Polish border, and they take out Lithuania and Latvia, the Baltic states. 2.5 weeks. It's all it takes. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops are captured. Look at the orange. Well, let's bring up the dates. Here are the objectives. There's Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, Kiev in the south. By the 9th of July, the yellow is gone. Here's the orange. It's gone by the 1st of September. My goodness, look at the north. They're knocking on the doors of Leningrad. In the center, Kiev falls on the 9th of September. That's only 10 weeks. And Moscow takes longer. German army doesn't get into Moscow, but they're knocking on the gates by the 5th of December. Rapid progress. Okay, here we go. What happens after this? Well, Leningrad has got its own formation of troops, the Leningrad front, the Leningrad army group. But it's been squeezed back from Poland through Belarus, out from around the fringes of the Baltic states, and it's now penned up around and inside the city of Leningrad. And it's cut off from, and a portion of it is penned up in the Oranienbaum enclave off to the west there on the Baltic shore. And the German army has got between the Leningrad front, there's the city of Leningrad, and the Volchov front in the east. So the Soviet forces are split. So, Finnish army, here's a story. In 1940, the Finns and the Russians have gone to war. Finland has only become independent of the Soviet Union in 1917, taking advantage of the disorganization of the October Revolution. And the Finnish army has established its independent state. But the Soviet army, still at peace with Germany in 1940 and free to do this, fights the Finnish army. They get a bad lesson from the Finnish army. The Soviet army is not filled with supermen, it's filled with slum dwellers from Moscow, Leningrad, and other places. And the Finns are very good at warfare in the forests, round the lakes, in the snow. The Soviet army doesn't forget this hard-learned lesson. Nevertheless, their sheer weight of numbers prevail, and the Finns are forced to hand over territory. They lose territory to the Soviet Union. Once the Germans arrive on the doorstep of Leningrad, the Finns take back the lost territory. Let me show you this. The rail link between Leningrad and Moscow is rapidly cut by the German army. And then all the rail links, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the road links are severed. The rail links have gone. That northern one, the top right, is the road link, Schisselberg road, that leads to Volchov. So the Germans have cut in between the Volchov part of the Soviet army and the Leningrad part of the Soviet army. This means that Leningrad, the city, is totally cut off. The Finnish in the north, and you can see them in the north here, this ellipse will show you, dug in on their old line, and in the top right corner of our map, they've reoccupied the shores of Lake Ladoga. So Leningrad is cut off. Let's move on. What we now see is something called the continuation war. There's very little fighting, a lot of movement, but very little fighting. And it boils down to this. You will see the Finnish army push the Soviet army away, and it reestablished its old border. And you look at the solid line, that's where it was in 1940. Now look what happens when the Finnish army advances and re-establish the old border. Leningrad, Lake Ladoga, and now the movement of the Finnish army. And the border re-establishes on the pre-1940 line. The Finnish are not demonstrating aggression, they are simply moving to reoccupy what they believe to be theirs. All right, so let's continue this story, the continuation war. Let's move on. This is Murmansk, up in the Arctic Ocean. Principally the British, but also the Canadians, are now feeding war supplies to the Soviet Union. There is Archangel also further to the east, but a lot goes into Murmansk. And the Soviet Union is unloading ships as fast as they can. Off those ships are coming shells, guns, tanks, trucks, food, everything you would want in war, oil. And a road is built from Murmansk heading down towards Leningrad. However, the arrival of the German 18th Army does this. It cuts Leningrad off by having a hard shoulder against the southern shores of Lake Ladoga. Let's look at it in more detail. There is the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, the Volchov front in the east, the Leningrad front in the west, separated by this entity, the 18th German Army. And they have achieved the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. And this is what they do. They cut off the Schisselberg road between Lipak and Schisselberg. Hard shoulders. The Soviets cannot help each other. So the Volchov front cannot get the supplies from Murmansk through to Leningrad. And that situation pertains from September 41 through to August 42. Okay, let's look at what happens next then. What we're going to see is Lake Ladoga turning into what becomes known as the Road of Life. In the Russian winter, from November onwards, Lake Ladoga freezes. When it's water, trade goes backwards and forwards with tugboats and barges and steamships. When it's frozen, it's never been required before, but now it's a necessity. Supply can only be done across the frozen surface. Horses, tractors, mechanical transport. Let's move on. And what you will see is this strange sight. The Russian engineers have cleared snow, and there's a solid bed of ice, and mechanical transport drives across it night and day. And this goes on. Spring for sure will always follow winter, and the ice begins to melt, and the trucks continue to roll till they start losing them. The ice is too thin. So look at this. We've got water now. Ice is gone. Let's start using barges and tugs. At the bottom, it's probably difficult to see, but that's a woman climbing aboard that tug. Most of those barges and most of those tugs are manned entirely by female crews. Release a man for the front, release a man for the factory. They are women. You get the same story, by the way, in the Pacific, where all women crews take the Liberty ships from the west coast of the United States across to Vladivostok, entirely crewed by women. Okay, we'll move on and look at this, because this is important. To get over the ice, you need to think about how thick it is. Well, November 41, it's iced, and that will last to April 42. Well, with 10 centimeters of ice, 4 inches if you're working in Imperial, you can get a pack horse and its handler across the ice. If we look at the next thickness level, another 2.5, 3 inches on, 17 centimeters, getting on for 7 inches or so, you can get a sledge. By the time you get to 8 inches of ice, 20 centimeters, you can get mechanical transport across. And you can move quite a little tonnage. Here's the tonnage. Follow this. In November, 1,500 tons of supplies. Next, December, as the ice is beginning to thicken, 52,000 tons of supplies. Hard, cold in January, 86,000 tons. And as the mechanics of this operation increases, in February, 113,000 tons of combat supplies cross the ice. But we start to get onto the cusp of spring. Finally, in March, you get 87,000 tons going across the ice, and it stops at the beginning of April. Because, look at the top left, the ice begins to melt. And I want to draw your attention to this. Look at that truck and note this. What you will see is that truck door is open. We've shifted 319,000 plus tons of supplies, but towards the end it becomes perilous. Look at that truck again. Now look at the door. It's open. Is that a driver being careless? No, no. They start to lose trucks because if you've got water and you're motoring through water, you can't see through the water. And the trucks start to find holes and they go down. And the drivers wedge the doors open, because if your truck goes into a hole, you've got seconds to get out. That's the way it works. Okay, let's move on. We've gone over the ice. We've delivered our combat supplies to the factories, to the workers, to the troops. The trucks, the sledges, the horses turn around and go back across the lake. Are they going back empty? Certainly not. Here we go. This is what they're going back with. Look at this. They're going back over that season. You can see the dates at the bottom. More than 500,000 civilian evacuees, 35,000 wounded soldiers, plant from 86 factories dismantled, taken back across the ice, reassembled on the other side. Collections from the museums and from the palaces. In the Oranienbaum enclave, you've got the great palaces, the Peterhof, the Catherine Palace. In the center of Leningrad, you've got the Hermitage. All these precious artifacts and works of art are going back across the ice. That's between November 41, April 42. Let's move on with the siege. That's just the first winter. There are more to come. Soldiers and workers have, well, here are the words, they have the highest priority. And there they are. Once you see those words, highest priority, you've got a bit of a ticket. What do you get with your ticket? Well, look at this. What you're going to get is this. You are going to get issued to you this. The temperature is down to -30 if you're working in Fahrenheit, -22. Got to eat something. How about that? Give us this day our daily bread. You get issued to you 125 grams. There is 125 grams. And if you're slightly bemused at how big that really is, there's my 1 foot ruler. That's how big it is. It's just over 3 inches long, just over 1.5 inches deep. Thank you, Lord, for our daily bread. On a bad day, half of it will be sawdust. Don't forget to say grace this evening. Military and workers only. Civilians fended for themselves. They found their own food. Okay, on we go with the story. This is inevitably going to lead to big time death. Big time. How big? This big. 700 to 1,000 civilians per day die in the siege. That's quite something. Well, doesn't stop there. Let's move on. Passing a body in the street becomes less than remarkable. Pulling a body on a sledge like that, member of your family, becomes unremarkable. And it happens in the snow. And when they get to the cemetery, you can't dig the ground, it's frozen. So you stack the body on a pile of bodies and the next snowfall covers the pile. But what happens next? Spring. The snow melts, the ice melts, and there are the bodies. And this group of unfortunates are now going to scrape a hole and put the bodies in. It is ghastly, terrible. More images. Let's move on. And we can see that the Russian people, ever resourceful, try hard. And the first things to start coming across the ice in the spring of 42 are seedlings. What are they growing? Have you ever seen cabbages so big? In 1942, having planted the seedlings in every open piece of ground in Leningrad, they produced 30,000 tons of cabbage. And what they don't eat fresh, they pickle, they salt and they pickle. The next year, look on the right side of the screen, they double it. 60,000 tons of cabbage. And you think yourself lucky because it's supplementing your bread or your sawdust. Okay. Did they try hard militarily? Of course they did. Look at this. We have the first Soviet offensive, the Siege offensive. We have the Volchov front on the right-hand side in the east. We have the Leningrad front on the left in the west. We've got the 18th German Army in between. And the Volchov front tries an offensive. And this is what happens. They attack. And their objective is to gain the Schisselberg Road. Because if they can get that road, they can get supplies into Leningrad. Well, they do attack. And they try to break through the German lines. They do get through, but instead of breaking out to the other side, all that happens is the Germans give ground and they contain the offensive in a pocket, a salient. Well, military men among you will know that salients are not good news because here comes the German counterattack. And you nip off the salient. The Soviets feel less than safe there. They turn around and they go back. And the Germans simply close the line. And there it is. Siege offensive fails. So we move on. Breaking the siege was never thought to be a quick action. And the Soviets now employ grey matter, industry, and military engineering ingenuity. Look what happens. The Finns are quiet. They don't shoot at the Soviets. They simply stay in their trenches and watch. They don't help the Germans. The Finns know that if the Germans win, they, Finland, aren't really wanting to be beholden to the Germans. They know that if the Soviets win, there'll be a price to pay if they join in. They sit there and they watch. Now see what happens. Here's Leningrad, right in the center, and the Volchov front in the east, and the Red Army engineers lay a road and lay a railway line to the edge of Lake Ladoga. And the road of life becomes very much more organized. Not only do they do that, they do this. They lay an electricity cable. Also, they lay this, which is an oil pipeline under the surface of the lake. And Leningrad starts to receive electricity because the electricity supply is very, very hit and miss because the generation of electricity takes fuel, and fuel is hard to come by. And petroleum is hard to come by, but with the laying of the cable and the laying of the line, life becomes easier. I see to my left, I've already got a question about, were electricity supplies interrupted? Oh, yes, they were. They get better after this. And what is more, we now look at that Schisselberg Road you see inside the red rectangle, and the Soviets are going to do something about that. The Finns remain quiet, but the Soviets are perpetually thinking, what are the Finns going to do? They then take a gamble. The Finns will probably do nothing, and they concentrate their efforts on another offensive. Let's have a look at it. Operation Iskra involves both the Volchov front in the east and the Leningrad front in the west, and they attack together. Let's see what happens. They attack together, and of course they're looking to gain the road on the southern shore of the lake. The Soviet Army engineers are hard on the heels of the fighting troops, and they're doing this. They are looking, while the fighting troops are pushing back the German front, the engineers are seeking to lay a road. They've prefabricated bridges, and they're going to start supply now behind Soviet Army lines. And that is what they achieve. But they achieve it whilst the battle, as you can see, rages around them. But the Germans never get back to the southern shore. And this happens in January 1943. Let's see how the siege is going to come to an end. So let's turn to 1943. And still in the city, people die, and they die by summer and by winter. And you walk past the bodies in the street. You don't give them a second glance. Also, the Germans take to shelling the city from time to time. If you look at this scene, you will see that people die on the streets of Leningrad. Shells come in. There's no military objective there. It is terror artillery. I'll show you this. This is a piece of shrapnel. It's solid iron, weighs a lot. And I brought that back from St. Petersburg when I was with a Viking Homelands cruise. And I hustled for it. I got it. That's a piece of Leningrad siege history. If that hit you, it was the finish. All right, let's go back. So, death is still there. Moving on then. We look at the Finnish army, still sitting there, and the Soviets become more confident that the Finns will remain in place. I've never found any historical evidence of the Finns actually saying to the Soviets, by the way, you go ahead, we're going to stay here. I think it's likely that they did have these exchanges. So let's see what happens next. We've got the Leningrad front, and if they've turned their attention away from watching the Finnish army, they can now build up the troops, and it goes like this. The troops arrive from deep inside the Soviet Union. Stalin has released the Siberian forces, confident that the Japanese are not going to attack in the east. And they go across Lake Ladoga by rail and by truck through the city of Leningrad, onto more ships, and into the Oranienbaum area south and to the west of the city, where the palaces are. And the build-up happens. Look at the build-up. What you get now is a build-up, a massive build-up of troops, infantry and armor and artillery on the Leningrad front. And the Volchov front, look at this, you will see they build up too. And that is going to mean a 2-army group attack on the German forces. And inevitably, it happens. And off they go. And they drive south and they drive west. Well, that actually is the tick in the box that says it's about to end in a German defeat. Because after that, there are only German defeats. Only. Let's move on then. We get towards the end of our story. The Soviet Army High Command announces on the 27th of January 1944 that the siege is lifted. The 872 days have come to an end. Physically, but not here. Let's move towards the end of our story. This is the Piskorevskoye Cemetery in Leningrad. The statue you see at the far end there is Mother Russia. There are many statues of Mother Russia. And behind that statue carved in the granite is a poem written by Olga Bergholz, who was born in 1910 in St. Petersburg and was in the city during the siege. I will read it to you. You can see it on the screen. Here lie Leningraders. Here are city dwellers, men, women and children, and next to them Red Army soldiers. They defended you, Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution, with all their lives. We cannot list their noble names here. There are so many of them under the eternal protection of granite. But know this, those who regard these stones, no one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. Put that there. Look at this. In this cemetery, there are 186 mass graves. Not just 186 graves, 186 mass graves. They contain this number of people. 470,000 bodies in that one cemetery. Is there any wonder then? These words are prophetic, and we shouldn't look at Mr. Putin or the Russians without thinking of this. Nothing is forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm at the end of my lecture. And just like on the ship, it's 45 minutes. I will be very happy to take your questions and further discussion, and there are plenty on the screen there. Let me see if I can answer some that I've been making a note of. It was raised as a point that Stalin is accredited with 20 million deaths, and by all kinds of means. Now, the truth of it is, no one really knows. It's an estimate. Whether it's actually numerically true or not, don't know. But there were a huge number of deaths attributable to the Second World War. Now, people talk about, oh, victims of the Nazis. I wish people wouldn't say that. They were victims of the Germans. We didn't go to war in the Gulf with a Republican Party army. We went with an American army or a New Labour army. No, we went with a British army. Nazis are a political party. No, this was Germany. But Stalin contributed to the millions of deaths himself with his internal purges and pogroms. So yes, it's probably true that Stalin did see off so many people that a fair proportion of that 20 million belonged to him. A question was asked, why didn't more people leave via Lake Ladoga? The scale of the lake is larger than it looks on the map. It's miles wide. And over 500,000 were taken out during that first winter. And eventually 1.5 million civilians were evacuated from Leningrad, and the only way they got out was across Lake Ladoga. Now, if you think that the population of Leningrad in 1941, to include the suburbs, Oranienbaum, for example, was 3.4 million, well, that's 1.5 million down who got out. That's quite an extraction. But you couldn't walk across the lake. You would have to be transported. I've been asked about Shostakovich. Shostakovich wrote his Leningrad Symphony. He didn't particularly want to, but he was told to by the Communist Party, and he did. He was a volunteer fireman in the city, actually. And there are famous pictures of him with his brass helmet, and he was a fire watcher. He wrote his Leningrad Symphony, and when I'm on the ship, the introit music that I use is at about 7.5 minutes into the symphony, you get a sound which is industrial, and it sounds like the steam hammers of the factories, which is what he intended. So Shostakovich Yeah, he was made to write that piece of music. He personally didn't rate it, and he wasn't a keen communist for sure. I'm looking at a very interesting question there, and they're all coming from the United States. I see. Is there anyone in the UK awake, or are you all at dinner, having another gin and tonic, perhaps? Well, it referred to Finland. It said, Finland as an ally, as a Nazi ally, why didn't they do things differently? Well, Finland was not an ally of Germany. When Germany offered to send an expeditionary force during the Russo-Finnish War in 1940, the Finns said no thank you. They didn't want to be beholden to anybody. They'd taken hundreds of years to get rid of Sweden and Russia. They didn't want to be beholden to the Germans. Finland was not a German ally. And they knew very well that if the Soviet Union came out on top after the war, they'd have to live with them. And it's interesting to note that after the war, when the Soviets were brutally occupying Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Romania, they left the Finns alone. They'd had a bad lesson at the hands of the Finnish army, and they didn't want to repeat that. Finland was developed into a capitalist state, thank you very much, without a Prague Spring or without anything like that. Question, water and electricity, were those supplies disrupted? Yes, because the power generation needed fuel, and the fuel was cut off. Every railway line was cut, every road link was cut, until we got to that second offensive when things were restored. Here, Zhukov's role in lifting the siege. Zhukov is best remembered for commanding the Belarus front. And the Belarus front was the front that went hell for leather for Berlin. He had more of a muted role in the Leningrad operation. The Leningrad front and the Volchov front, much bolstered by troops from the Far East eventually, were the ones that looked after the relief of the Leningrad siege. Zhukov Stalin was always very suspicious of Zhukov, because Zhukov had too much success, and Stalin was always shutting him down and sending him off to the sidelines a bit. When it came to the final push, through to the Zelo Heights and on to Berlin, Stalin had Zhukov present his plan, and he accepted his plan for Berlin. And when it came to the victory parade in Moscow, Stalin was going to ride the big white horse. He'd made himself a marshal, and he was going to ride the big white horse and say, I won the war. And the horse threw him 3 times. And he said, get Zhukov to do it. He's a cavalryman. And his secret hope was that Zhukov would be thrown off the horse. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. So let's have a little look. One final question, shall we? Oh, here we go. Hurrah, the United Kingdom. He said, still very much awake. Good. Did the Germans try and bomb the lake? Yes, they did. Leningrad was mightily bombed, and they tried bombing the lake. But, you know, during the war, bombing was never that accurate. Unless you were a Ju-87 or something, and you were coming down and pointing your nose at the target. Most bombing, even at the medium level, was usually miles off target. It was reckoned in 1940 that if you were in the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and you got a bomb within 5 miles of your target, you'd done very well. And it's only later in the war when we devised better bomb sites. The Germans did bomb the lake, but of course the Soviets had every anti-aircraft gun that they possessed either side of the lake at the entry and exit points. And it was very, very dangerous for the Luftwaffe to try and bomb the lake. And there's no great evidence that they put huge holes in the lake and the trucks fell through. And if they did put a hole or two in the lake, then the Russian engineers simply put a bulldozer in and carved away the snow and said, there's the new route. So there it is. I'll take just one more. Just one more. Oh, I'm being told by James, who is our technical director, to keep going, and I'm happy to do so. Here we are. This is, I was wondering if somebody would mention this. Does Mr. Putin, is he affected by this? You can bet your bottom dollar Mr. Putin is affected by this. Mr. Putin is KGB through and through and through. And they are all devoted communists, and they are brought up on a diet, a force-fed diet of don't say thank you to anybody because we did it all ourselves. And we were left in the lurch by the United Kingdom. France deserted. The United States couldn't give a damn about Russia. And the Soviet Union, we were left in the lurch by them. We did it all ourselves. And this is force-fed. And Mr. Putin is desperately suspicious. His prime task, as it should be for any leader of any state, is defense of the state. But he sees that primarily as fending off everybody else. The Soviet Union or Russia can do this itself. And you can see it up here. And you can be as friendly as you like. The last one we had that was a real thinker and a guy that did kind of stretch out was Mr. Gorbachev. And he and Ronald Reagan got the act together, and we are where we are because of them. But with Mr. Putin, we're back to nothing is forgotten. That's for sure. Let's see if I can find another one down here. What happened to the Amber Room? Well, do come on Viking Homelands and do go to the reproduction Amber Room on the tour. We don't know where the real Amber Room is. It's gone. A lot of things are missing. I mean, there are all kinds of theories about holes in mountains with trains inside them, full of artwork. And out there is supposed to be the Amber Room. May find it one day. You never know. But the Oranienbaum enclave was well defended by the Soviets, but things did go missing. Things did go missing. It says here, Mr. Putin is very much a Russian, and he saw how Mr. Gorbachev was treated and the breakup of the Soviet Union. True. Absolutely true. I'm not sure Mr. Gorbachev was treated in any way badly other than by Russians. He was feted in the West. Mr. Reagan thought he was a great guy, and so did Mrs. Thatcher. And if you could please Mrs. Thatcher, you can please anybody. She said, he is a man with whom I can do business. High praise from her. As and when we do start sailing again, if you haven't done it, make an effort to go to the Baltic. It used to be just Viking Homelands, but there are other cruises now which take you to the Baltic, because not only do you get to wonderful St. Petersburg, and you see the tomb of the royal family, you can see the Church of the Holy Blood, you can see all the Hermitage and the great museums. You kind of get a feel for the place. And you also get to go to Helsinki and see what it means to be Finnish. And certainly one of the lectures I give on that cruise is Finland's struggle, how the Finns were caught between the might of Sweden and the might of Russia. And it took hundreds of years for them to gain their freedom, and they stole it in 1917 when Russia was diverted by its revolution. So great stories in the Baltic. I invite you to consider very seriously going to the Baltic. And of course, once you're on a Viking ship, you're traveling more than first class. You really are. You're traveling diamond class. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 8 o'clock. I'm conscious that some of you want your dinner, some of you may want your lunch, or some of you may want your tea. I don't know. Been great talking to you. I may talk to you again. My great hope is that I get to talk to you on board one of the wonderful Viking ships. I'm next on a Viking ship, please God, on the 28th of June this year on the Venus. And we're going to start in Bergen and end up in Greenwich in London. And I have some tales to tell you then. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you with the Red Army Choir singing The Sacred War. And for the Russian people, it is a sacred war. Ladies and gentlemen, good night. До свидания.